A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to a special edition of True Crime Daily, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. Our cases this week are all about the victims of serial killers who survived their attackers and they lived to tell their stories. Here is a preview of a new TV series dedicated to the survivors.
I don't know how she survived.
I can still see him standing there.
But she did.
He stabs me in my neck. He says, I'm going to take your son. And I said, take me instead.
I fell right into the trap, like a trapped animal.
It was that his total was 30-something people.
There really are monsters.
His plan is to kidnap these women, keep them in the basement, and impregnate them.
I was raped and shot in that garage. At this moment, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to die.
Is this guy going to bury me here?
You can choose to be a victim, or you can be a survivor. I chose to be a survivor. If I do make it through this, I'm going to know every detail of your face, because I'm going to get you someday. I survived a serial killer.
Our guest today is Alicia Dennis, People Magazine's executive editorial director. Alicia is featured as an expert throughout the series. People Magazine investigates Surviving a Serial Killer, which presents the harrowing survival stories based on firsthand accounts of female victims who unbelievably escaped their serial killers. Alicia is with us now. Alicia, welcome. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Anna. I really appreciate being here.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I have to admit, here on the podcast, we are absolutely addicted to People Magazine Investigates, and also the crime section of your website and of your magazine. I mean, you all do an extraordinary job at telling people's stories in such a respectful manner, and I just think that you're a wonderful source for that kind of crime storytelling.
That means so much to me to hear that. You know, People Magazine has told crime stories ever since the magazine launched, and we're celebrating our 50th year, if you can imagine 50 years in being, right? And so people, when they think about People, a lot of times they think, oh, celebrities and movie stars and musicians, and of course we're all that, but we're also have had a crime section since the very beginning. And the way that it's expanded, like you said, you know, you can go to the website, you can read about it in the magazine, but expanding it into this show, this People Magazine Investigate show, and now this one that's focusing specifically on survivors of serial killers, I think is a really unique way to put the story in the perspective of the victims, you know, the people that are in the center of these cases and not necessarily the killers themselves.
Absolutely. And this is a series for investigation discovery. And we're going to talk about two cases that will be presented in episodes that will be airing on June 2nd, correct?
That's right. That's right. We're lucky in that once our episodes in this 6-part series are airing on Investigation Discovery, people can also check them out on Max. So if you happen to miss it and your dates are messed up, you can get it on Max. But yeah, you're right. This is one that's going to be on Investigation Discovery then.
So the first case we're going to discuss is called Surviving the Handsome Devil. And this is about a serial killer who was dubbed, I guess, by the media and police as the Handsome Devil, which, you know, I don't like calling any killer handsome. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just bothers me. But I understand, but it bothers me.
I know. I hear you. I think that it was just his looks were so striking. People talked about how searing his blue eyes were every time someone would describe this person as a suspect. That was the thing that was standing out in those descriptions. So that's kind of how he got that moniker. I agree with you that romanticizing any kind of monster in this way is not something that we'd ever want to do. And it just kind of makes you feel a little bit creepy. At the same time, when you look at like the Ted Bundys of the world, a lot of these diabolical, killer types really used every tool they had, their looks, their charm, their charisma, to lure victims into their lives and trick them, and a lot of times the authorities as well.
Absolutely. And that can be disarming because we have, I think, in our heads, in our minds, this idea of the monster and that the killer will look like a monster. Right. And he or she does not frequently look like a monster, which is disarming and, of course, makes them that much more of a predator. So we're talking here about the case of Bruce Lindell, and he was a serial killer with these, again, amazing blue eyes, which was something that witnesses and survivors could point to as a feature. He terrorized the greater Chicago area. And what is amazing to me is that to this day, that they're still trying to analyze if there are other victims connected to him.
You're right. That's, I think, what's so interesting when we dig into these cases, to see the ways that tools have grown and changed that are available to law enforcement. And as DNA testing advances, as other kinds of tools like that get better and better, it becomes clearer and clearer that a lot of these open cold cases do have a thread, a piece of DNA that's maybe been, sitting in a cold case file for sometimes decades, that can finally give families that have had these unending painful questions some answers. And in connection with Bruce Lindell, authorities are still finding connections to cases that are long cold.
Is he still alive?
Bruce Lindell died in 1981, which also is mind-blowing that there would still be cases connected to him that would still be being looked at, isn't it?
Right,
isn't it just hard to believe? It really is. And there have been times in cases that authorities believe that it's necessary to exhume bodies so that there will be more DNA evidence to try to match some of these cases with. And I just feel so much for the families who are asking over and over again, what happened to my loved one, and what was the actual answer that we have never had. And so I think that's part of the reason why, even though getting justice in this case is over in a way, and that he's no longer on the earth, and he's dead, but there's still that longing to know that people have despite that.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's important that victims and survivors that their cases still be investigated even if the killer is dead, because they still have rights, and their rights should not die with the killer.
You're
I don't
exactly
think that's
right.
fair. I don't think that's fair to them. So there were several women who had run-ins with this man. Back in 1979, 19-year-old Sherry Hobson, she worked a bunch of jobs and she was waiting tables at a local restaurant, and that's when she met a man who offered to give her free flying lessons. At first I thought, oh my God, is that the serial killer?
Right.
And I was like, ooh, that's an interesting way to get a woman. But as it turns out, she was really enjoying this, and it would be a parachute instructor named Bruce with those blue eyes, who, had an interest in her, and she and him, and they started dating. But she tells a story about how he was so controlling, like waiting for hours outside the restaurant for her to get off. I mean, who sits there in a car waiting? We've seen that with other killers. to be that controlling. And I think it's really important, Alicia, that people realize this is 1979. So cars are huge.
Yeah.
They're boats. There are
They
no
are.
cell phones. You know, if you want to talk to someone, you have to call them at work or call them at home. It's not as it was now. And also police departments, and we didn't have the internet. So police departments did have a form of communicating with each other, but not to the level here where you could piece things together so much more quickly.
Yeah, I know. And when you look at these kinds of cases and you imagine all of the different barriers that were put in place for law enforcement to solve them, if a crime took place in different jurisdictions, if, there was a MO that was repeated in a crime scene that they didn't know about because it happened in another state or it happened somewhere else, the level of communication that is available now, with computers and cell phones and tracking on satellites and being able to know where people are going from place to place, not to mention the surveillance camera footage and things that are available there as well,
And so it kind of makes sense when you put everything in perspective, how sometimes dots, which we can see clearly now, could not have been observed and connected. So for some reason, Bruce had this obsession with Sherry's teenage friend who herself had been found murdered. And her name was Elizabeth Beth Drews, and she had gone missing in June of 1977, a few years before they started dating. So I'm curious, do you think that he was connected to that friend that was
Do you?
I'm like, I would certainly be suspicious there. I realize we can't answer all the questions, but when I don't believe in coincidence in crime.
That's really smart of you. And that's probably why you have such a popular podcast. I think the obsession that he had with Sherry, and at first, when someone's really into you and you have a crush on them, at first, that level of obsession, at least to her, didn't seem to be as creepy as it turned out to be. The further it went, the more it went. But him talking about that case and her being, talking about how that was a friend of hers and that seeming to pique his interest and having him want to talk about it more, at the time wasn't necessarily a red flag. But it definitely connects things now as you look back on what was going on in his mind. And what you see a lot in serial killers is that level of obsession and then that wanting to relive the crime scenes and wanting to find, some kind of sense of power over other people in doing that. And I know the FBI and authorities have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort, a lot of money in trying to profile and understand serial killers and the criminal mind. And that's like something that's impossible to do that in a way because everybody's different and every case is different, but there are common threads.
So she, for some reason, he was so obsessed with this murder in the woods, and he apparently dragged her into the woods and wanted to see where her friend's body had been found. And I guess she refused, and they got into an altercation, and somehow she manages to survive this. It doesn't appear that he tried to kill her, but, he was in a relationship with her. She managed to get herself out of that and cut off the relationship. It's intriguing to me that she was not killed by him. Like, is it, because sometimes with these serial killers, and I've interviewed girlfriends of or significant others of, they have a primary relationship. And yet they go out and that's not the person they harm or that they necessarily torture their primary relationship, but then they go out and they kill others, which is, it's almost as if, like, how could I put this? You leave your work at home, right? You don't bring it home. You don't bring your work home. It's just a weird separation, which he apparently had.
That's, I think, a very smart way to look at it, and potentially exactly what it was that he was doing. Almost, when we have talked to survivors of serial killers, many times they'll describe this switch, or almost this moment where the person that they thought they were talking to, or they thought they knew, changed and went from sometimes, a joking, jovial guy next door that you would allow to pick up your mail and walk your dog, to all of a sudden becoming this blank slate, this completely empty face, void of expression. We've had a few people describe it almost like their eyes were like a shark. There was nothing behind them. And they went from being a person that you could connect to being this monster all of a sudden showed up. And you wonder if in the case of Bruce Lindell and his relationship with Sherry, that did she luck out, that he did not have that switch happen with her? Was he taking her to a killing grounds at the time and she managed to not go there with him at the same time? Or is it more like, what you were talking about? I know with the BTK killer, there was this period of time that he was happy in his relationship where he didn't kill anyone for a while. And it wasn't until later that when that relationship faltered or changed in some way that he went back to, doing the horrible things he'd been doing before. But you just never know. A lot of it has to do with circumstance and
opportunity.
Yes.
Opportunity is huge, because it's always about their self-preservation. That's the other thing. That's why serial killers can continue, because they must survive for the next one. Oh, it's just so chilling. So later that year, in 1979, another woman, Annette Lazar, crossed paths with Bruce, and she too survived. 19-year-old Annette was walking to a friend's house when a stranger drove by with piercing blue eyes and stopped his car, asked Annette where she was going. He managed to convince her to go hang out at his place. But then when they reached his garage, he shut the door, and that was it. I mean, this whole thing was a trap. His demeanor changed instantly, like you just described, how it just, like a curtain falls so quickly. He became intimidating and aggressive, holding her at gunpoint before sexually assaulting her. This, to me, is just unbelievable. So Annette says that she managed to calm him down. This is after he has assaulted her and he's holding her captive. She said she was feeding his ego and feigning interest in having a relationship with him, that they exchanged numbers and he let her go. I mean, that is just crazy.
It is. And I think it's an example, when you'll listen to Annette's story, which is just heart-wrenching, her recalling this, that all of her survival instincts kicked in and her mind was racing, just trying to think of what is it possibly that I could do? I can't overpower him. He had a gun to her head, and she just didn't feel that physically she'd be able to escape by, using her force. So it was about her trying to figure out, how can I trick him into thinking that I won't tell anyone and I should be let go and I find, him attractive. These things that just kick in that seem just impossible that she would be able to have that kind of strength and ability, that acting ability in that moment. But I think what's so interesting about these stories, Anna, is the strength of these women as they're recounting to us the most horrific moments in their lives. and the healing that they tell us come with them being able to explain, this is why I did that. Because a lot of times, later when they would try to explain that to a family member or the police or authorities, people don't understand what it's like in that moment of survival, that anything that you can think of to get you out of that situation is what you're going to try to do. And sometimes people, how could you have pretended that? How could you have said that? How could you have exchanged numbers with him? Well, I was trying to live through it. I was trying to get out.
And amazing that it worked, and thank God that it did.
Yeah.
But what really disappoints me here is she went to the police. When she was freed, she went to the police. And they didn't take Annette seriously, and they questioned Bruce with his blue eyes, and that was it. They didn't do anything.
I think that in the way that victims' stories are handled now has grown and changed and evolved so much in the decades. I think there's been more training about sexual assault. There's been more training and sharing of information between authorities and the FBI about serial killers, about the charisma, a lot of times, of these predators. And I really hope that by these survivors sharing the details of their stories, that in this day and age, you have investigators and detectives who are learning from those mistakes, those really awful, horrible mistakes. Because, when we talk to police now about these cases, there are many times that they will say to us in our episodes, we just are horrified that we didn't handle this differently. We're horrified that we didn't listen to this victim in a different way, that we didn't investigate this in a different way. We could have maybe saved someone else's life. And they imagine those moments when they, come across the next victim. Had they done something differently, could they have saved that person? And that's got to be something that haunts you.
Yes, because to free him, to permit him to continue to do the work that he was doing. And I mean, again, you're right. Police training has changed. And for whatever reason, at this point, they believed him and they didn't believe her, which is just such a shame, such a shame. What ultimately stopped this man and finally got him arrested?
Well, you do want to watch the episode.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Fair enough.
You do need to follow along with us a little bit. I mean, we've talked kind of about the ins and outs of this to some degree, but I think you're going to find this one particularly interesting because I don't know that I've ever seen a case solved this way.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll leave it there.
Okay.
I'll give you that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right, so let's now move on to our next case of serial killers. I think the only thing scarier than one serial killer is a duo of brothers who are serial killers. What could possibly be more frightening than one, but two?
It's a nightmare scenario, and it's so rare. It's something that you just don't see very often in cases where there are siblings that are killing as a duo, killing together. And, it's just really shocking. All these cases are chilling, but this is just, it has a whole nother level of, I think, of fear and a nightmarishness about it.
Oh, all of this is giving me nightmares right now. So our next case is out of Toledo, Ohio. And in the early 1980s, the brothers Anthony and Nathaniel Cook terrorized the area with a string of sexual assaults and murders. And the pair liked to target couples that were sitting, I guess, in their cars. before forcing them to drive into like wooded areas, and then they would commit their horrible crimes on them. And one woman, Cheryl Bartlett Fan, survived the attack to tell her story. Her case goes back to 1981 when she was just 18 years old, and she was a young mom living with her fiance and fiance Bud, and had a little one. I think what so disturbs me about the brothers is, again, the idea that there were two of them and they were related. I know this is a little bit of a sidetrack. Do you know if they've ever been studied in a way? Every serial killer, there are many forensic psychiatrists and psychologists out there who specialize in this area, but the idea of having brothers like this that are serial killers, as opposed to just, as we know, there are, for as long as there's been crime, there have been crime families. I was just kind of wondering about these two, the Cooks.
Yeah, you really hit on a very smart question that I don't know for sure how much studying of them has been done, but I would assume a great deal, just because of the rarity of this particular kind of scenario. Right. And on top of that, I know that the investigators that were working these cases spent a lot of time piecing together how they came about and how what their the way that they worked together, the way that they lured people in. And so I think that a lot has been done to try to understand exactly how these crimes were committed and how that all came about. At the same time, it is very rare. It makes you wonder, whatever they do learn long term, how much is that going to help the next case? How often is this going to be? Well, we
let's hope it's
like
really
never.
rare.
We hope
Right.
like never.
Right, exactly. It's just so curious, it just really stands out. So back to Cheryl's case. So she had someone watch the baby for the night so she could surprise her fiance for a romantic night out. So she walked by herself to where Bud was working, and Bud was, of course, very upset with her for walking alone at night. And then after they had their moment, their evening, then Bud and Cheryl walked home, and then a man with a gun approached them. They were like a block or two away from their house.
Yeah.
And this is what's so weird to me. So the assailant here, one assailant at the time, he hands them two ski masks to wear, that they have to wear the ski masks.
Right.
And then they kind of said no, they refused, and because they were also being told to go somewhere, and they're offering their wedding rings and whatever money they had.
Right.
But that's not what this attacker wanted.
It isn't. And just imagine, the fear and the terror of not understanding when you are being assaulted at night and walking together and no one is around to hear you, and just thinking, well, I'm being mugged. This is just a basic mugging, and take everything. Just, we're not going to resist. Just have all of it. It's so insidious and horrific what, happens to this couple, and, because they were brought to another location, and, Cheryl was assaulted. And as she tells this story about when another person comes into the room, she thinks they're being saved. She thinks someone else has come, and that means that this is all over now and we're going to be saved, because certainly now this person has been caught in this awful crime scene and this is over and everything is going to be okay now. And just the overwhelming horror that, no, this person is part of the serial killer brothers and is their to continue this crime, is not there to be their savior. It's just awful.
And that
it's
moment, when you have that moment of hope, that
Yes.
sense, that false sense of like, oh my God, this is finally over, only to learn it is far worse than what you expected. It's like what you see in a movie.
Exactly.
It's a horrible twist of events, like really horrible. So they assaulted Cheryl and they forced the fiance to watch.
Yeah,
And
it's
then,
just another level of, depravity and horror and the pain that this poor couple went through.
oh my gosh. And then I guess they shot Cheryl and then they attempted to shoot the fiance, but the firearm jammed. So then the brothers took off. And Cheryl lost consciousness. Obviously, she was very seriously injured. She survived. Their relationship, of course, did not survive. This was too much for anyone. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's really impossible to imagine everything that your body and your emotions survive in these kinds of attacks, and the years and years of healing that it takes. A lot of these survivors will talk to us about that this is something that lives on for them every day. It's sometimes a smell or a color or a particular time of year, a color of a car or gravel. There will be something that they did not expect that will take them right back to those moments that they've tried so hard to move past and to forget. And part of the reason, because it's always surprising to me when people are willing to do shows like this with us at People Magazine Investigates, why would you want to relive that? Why would you want to tell that story and the details of everything that you lost in those moments? And what we find is that because they are living with this over and over again and every single day in some cases, that this is a moment for them to take back that story in some way and to prove that it has not defined their lives, that they can share it and hopefully help another victim who feels alone and feels unable to share it yet. Maybe help law enforcement understand how to investigate these cases better. Maybe find some way to move past it in their own mind, that in a lot of these shows, we are taking the survivors back to the places this happened. This happened to them. And they have embraced is too big of a word, but they have wanted to do that so that the power that that place has had over them and has had over their lives, that some of that goes away. And that now, there's going to be a different memory there of them facing it and of them being able to talk about it. And I think in her case, the ability to have, evidence that was preserved for nearly 20 years helped police understand the scope of the killings that occurred with these two brothers, Anthony and Nathaniel. It's 9 people between 1973 and 1981. And if it wasn't for people like her being willing to talk about the most horrible thing that any of us could ever imagine, then these people wouldn't be brought to justice and there wouldn't be, help for the other victims.
I think the difference with crime reporting, this type of true crime reporting that we do, is that when someone agrees to sit down and wants to talk, they want to tell their story or they wouldn't sit down. The stories that we don't tell and the people that we don't get a chance to share with, let's say in a more public manner, but we may have a private conversation with and say, thank you for reaching out, but I don't want to discuss this anymore, or I'm done. I've said all that I'm going to. Completely understand that, like completely 100%. And that's probably the camp that I personally would fall into. Like, I don't want to talk about this anymore. But I feel that when someone who has been through something so horrific says, no, I want to talk about this story. And as you say, I want to take this back. You need to hear this from my perspective. And what happened to me, I think we owe it to them to listen. And because that's all we have is to sit and listen and sit and be with them as they tell their story and do our best in the most respectful manner to convey the conversation that we have just shared.
Yes. And it's a huge responsibility that these people are trusting that with us, either as, reporters, as being able to have a platform or, a venue for them to share those stories, whether it's in writing or, audio stories, podcast stories, television broadcast shows and stories. It is really, you're exactly right. It's the only thing we really have to give them is to listen, listen and to respect that.
And I learn a lot. Again, people always ask me, like, how do you do this? Because it's just so depressing. And it is absolutely depressing what one human can do to another. But for me, what is enlightening, what is hopeful, what I learn from is how a human can process this level of trauma and emerge and survive and be strong. And it teaches us about survival, in some cases about compassion, in some cases about forgiveness, and how you process trauma. And there is not one person that I've sat with and talked with whom I haven't learned from. Mm-hmm. And that to me is the gift, gift.
Yeah, Anna, you're right. People do ask a lot about how can you be surrounded by that much darkness and how does it not affect you? Well, of course it does affect you. It does. But it's exactly what you said, that to be able to give these people the opportunity to maybe in some small way process their trauma by sharing it. That's huge. And it's really important across the board, not only for them, but for everybody that learns something, for everything that you learn, the people that listen to you are learning it, the people that, watch the shows, that read about it, they're all learning something. And that's what's interesting, that there would be hope and inspiration and uplift in the most horrific of stories. And that's what these survivors bring to these stories.
They're amazing. They really are. Can we reveal at all how Cheryl thought maybe she knew who her attackers were?
Well, sure.
Okay. Okay. So, move forward a few years, and Cheryl saw their faces on the news and said, "Oh, my God, it's them. It's them."
And obviously different survivors have different experiences. They're all incredibly unique. But there are a lot of times that survivors will talk about, as much as they're trying to push away the horrible things that are happening to them, at the same time, they're also soaking up the details so that they can remember later. We had one survivor who had gone through being kidnapped and tortured, and she talked about at one point being stuffed inside this plastic container, and she tried to memorize everything about it. She tried to see if there were any serial numbers that she could read on the side of it. Every moment that she could feel and imagine, she tried to memorize. So I think with Cheryl, and when you look at, just like you had mentioned in this story, that she and her fiance had been told to put on ski masks and obviously brutalized and traumatized, those seem like all kinds of reasons not to remember. But that was the moments, and the men were etched in her memory. And so there was no question when she saw them again on the news that she knew immediately who they were.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. There were multiple murders involved that these two were responsible for, and they ultimately get a plea deal. How do you feel about that?
It's so difficult to know how to feel about a lot of these plea deals. I know when we talk to authorities and investigators who are working these cases, and many times they've worked these cases in such a way that they were the first people upon a crime scene that keeps them awake in the middle of the night, something that they never, ever forget. And so it makes it very difficult to even imagine a plea deal when those are the moments that are seared into your brain, that you believe these people are responsible for creating and for committing. At the same time, you hear authorities talk about how important it is to get information for families who don't have answers to where their loved ones are. So a lot of times in these plea deal scenarios, you're looking at what information can we get to be able to solve cases that are going to bring answers to these people who are desperate for answers, and how much are we willing to give up to get that information in regard to the plea deal.
It's astonishing. I mean, you've got here Anthony Cook pleaded guilty to 9 murders and multiple sexual assaults. Nathaniel pleaded guilty to 3 murders and 3 additional assaults. Anthony got a life sentence. Nathaniel was sentenced to 75 years with the possibility of parole after 20 years. And dear Lord, he was released in 2018, but registered sex offender and under extreme supervision. Excuse me, there's no such thing as extreme supervision. We don't have the resources for that. And it just bugged. Why did he have to be released? Why should this man be released and enjoy life and have a good cup of coffee down the street because that's what he feels like having this morning because he's got the freedom to do it?
Yeah, I hear you.
I
think
just
it's
don't understand.
such a difficult thing to wrap your brain around, completely difficult. And I know that a lot of times investigators spend hours and hours making sure that family members, families of victims understand what it is that's being bargained away. And in a lot of cases, make sure that they have not permission per se, but that they do have the understanding of the families that that's what's going to happen in this plea deal, that we're going to find out this other information, and it's possible that this person could be walking free in however many years. It's
awful. Awful. Well, this particular episode, Surviving the Cook Brothers, will be premiering Sunday, June 9th on Investigation Discovery. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about these cases. And I know there'll be so much more on the show that will give us the context that we desire.
Well, I really appreciate the work that you do and the time that you spend looking at all kinds of cases, cases that run the gamut. And it's really an honor to be able to talk to you about the ones that we're looking at in our show. So thank you for that.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. And thank you again. We have a lot of respect and admiration for the work that you all do at People Magazine Investigates and People Crime. So thank you again. Alicia, I presume that, People is everywhere. So it almost sounds ridiculous for me to say, and where can we find out more about People?
No, I really appreciate you asking me, actually, because you can read about these stories in People Magazine. Of course, we're covering a lot of these very stories and talking to these survivors in the pages of People, but you can also go to people.com, read about about it. Investigation Discovery, of course, see the shows there and look online. And like I said, catch the streaming on Max if you happen to miss it on Investigation Discovery. So.
Terrific. You can find this episode and all episodes of our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our newsletter at our website. So until next time, this is True Crime Daily, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. And as we always say, don't do crime.